Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Michael St. Pierre. I'm the current board president of the CEWW BOCES. And on behalf of my board, welcome. Every year, the Rural Schools Association meets in Cooperstown during the month of July. And we are here this evening to give input to their planning process so they can have a really good summer conference. And they're having these forums in other places also, so to get input from all over the state. Most of you here this evening are well aware that the fiscal needs of our schools are often put on the back burner because we're rural. The cities and the urban areas have more people, more votes, and of course, politics is politics. So add to that the geographical challenges we have to get our kids where they need to go. That's another problem for us because we're so rural. So that's why we're here this evening to get together to try to come up with our own ways to manage our rural schools, since maybe we don't always have the money, but perhaps we have ideas and abilities to maybe think out of the box and come up with our own way to get it done. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Davey here and get the ball rolling.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. St. Pierre. And just a couple of quick comments. And first, on behalf of Champlain Valley Educational Services, our board, and all of our component school districts, we're so thankful to see all of our attendees here tonight. What a privilege it is to have David Little, the Executive Director of the Rural Schools Association. And I want to personally thank all of you. And please excuse me, I'm not going to do introductions because our real main purpose is to hear from David and have the collective conversation. But we have a wide variety of higher education, business, the schools, our social services agencies, and I look around the room and I see many tremendous leaders and community-minded leaders who have been so involved in supporting our schools and supporting our communities, supporting our students, and making a difference politically in education across our entire North Country to really support not only our schools, but our communities and our people. And we're so fortunate to live in one of the most beautiful places in the country, but also have the support and the opportunity to work together to build a great community and support each other. With that said, I'd like to just share a little bit of information very briefly, David. When you look at Champlain Valley Educational Services, just a reminder, CVES BOCES consists of 16 school districts. There's approximately 3,300 full and CVES BOCES in our 16 districts. Approximately 3,300 full and part-time staff members work in our 16 component districts in CVES. We service approximately 14,000 students, pre-K through grade 12. And the collective economic impact of all of our school districts in CVES is approximately, for this year, 22-23, it's $448 million, so almost $450 million in economic impact, supporting our schools, supporting our students, and supporting our communities to provide high-quality education. So the economic impact that schools have in supporting our communities, supporting our businesses, and the centerpiece and the cornerstone of our communities is essential. Today, we're here to talk with the Executive Director of the Rural Schools Association, who is a leader statewide. The Rural Schools Association has approximately 300 school districts statewide involved. And with that said, David has been the Executive Director of the Rural Schools Association since 2014. Prior to that, he was the Director of Governmental Relations for the New York State School Boards Association. Prior to that, was the public service, he was committed to public service and legal counsel for the New York State Assembly, and then the Senate, including being the Home Rule Counsel and local government counsel to the majority leader. So he is experienced in leading organization, working with our legislators, and providing high-level executive support to our schools and our communities at the highest level. So it's our privilege this evening to welcome David Little, who is an attorney from Capital Law School with his Juris Doctorate. So he has the experience and the background to not only help bring ideas into action, but also to help us put together across the state an advocacy platform for our Rural Schools Association and our rural schools for next year's budget campaign. So David, it's our privilege to welcome you on behalf of the North Country, and please help me give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Mike. When he describes the background, it makes me think what I did back then, you know, what I do now is penance for what I was involved in back then. So here's the idea, and this is the second time we've done a round of these. I'm going to do a dozen of these forums around the state, from Riverhead out on the end of Long Island to Fredonia, and from Lisbon up in St. Lawrence County all the way down to the southern tier. We're going to do 12 and cover what we hope are pretty representative cross-section of our rural communities. The idea is not just to hear from, we want to hear from the schools, but we want to hear from the communities that host the schools as well, because we have to get a sense of what everyone's challenges are so that we can put that together into a policy brief. Those of you who picked up a copy of The Forgotten Family Member, The Forgotten Family Member is the policy brief that was the result of the last time we did this. And this was very intentional. That's a Dust Bowl family leaving their farm back in the 1930s. The last time we did this, we had just come out of the Great Recession, and not one state leader had acknowledged the fact that New York State had just experienced the second largest outward migration in U.S. history, second only to that Dust Bowl. And that Dust Bowl was the entire Midwest. Okay, we had 1 million people leave out of one section of one state, and nobody talked about it. And the reason nobody talked about it was because any business that might want to come into the state would feel like they were swimming upstream, right? That you couldn't get an entrance because everybody was jamming the exit, you know, to get out of here. But I saw it every place I went. I couldn't go to a school district that hadn't lost a third of its student enrollment because the parents had left for the jobs, and of course the kids left with the parents. And the timing was impeccably ironic. Okay, if you remember back, I don't know, 15 years ago, when Governor Spitzer, for the 15 minutes that he was in office, Governor Spitzer signed the court settlement with the Campaign for Fiscal Equity that said that the state did indeed owe billions of dollars to its schools that should have been paid to uphold its constitutional responsibility of providing what the court called a sound basic education to every child. Okay? And they started to pay that. And the way they started to pay it upstate was in something called Excel Aid. Every school has a building aid ratio. If you can get your community to put in a new auditorium or to put in new classrooms, you might have a 75% state aid ratio. So if the community's willing to pay 25%, the state has to write a blank check for whatever that 75% is. It's not something that they like to do, but it makes for a very efficient distribution scheme if you have to give a lot of money throughout the entirety of the state. So for all of upstate, they decided we're going to distribute money so that nobody has a local share for building aid until this money is used up that we have to pay. And they called it Excel Aid. So everybody did something. Everybody either renovated space or they built on. You can't go to a school district that hasn't had something new in the last 15 years that was built, because you could go to your public, you could go to the community and say, we'd like to put up whatever it is, and you don't have to pay anything for it. The state, this one's on the state. Okay? And they did that. And so everybody built out, and then almost immediately the Great Recession said, you're not going to have any kids in there, and you're not going to have any money to pay staff to be in there. So we have this vacant space. Okay? So our solutions to rural issues have not always been efficient. So the idea of the first round when we did this, when we created this document, said, I want to hear from everybody. I want to find out not only what the challenges of the communities are, we've got to hear from higher ed, and we've got to hear from business, military, if there's a presence in the area. We've got to hear from everybody. We've got to get a well-rounded idea of what the challenges are, and we've got to hear any potential solutions that anybody's got. Then we're going to put that all together, and we're going to make a policy brief based on that, and have that be the basis of our advocacy campaign, because quite honestly, at the time, now we have Governor Hochul, who's from the Buffalo area. But if you'll recall, for a generation, there hasn't been a state leader, until we had Governor Hochul, there hasn't been a state leader that touched public education north of the Tappan Zee Bridge in about 20 years. Okay? Take governor out of it, but until she was appointed, the governor was from the Bronx, right? The majority leader and the speaker of the Assembly and the Senate, both from the city, the Attorney General, the state controllers from Long Island, the chairs of each of the education committees in both houses are both from the city. Well, one's from Yonkers, but you know, I don't know how you tell the difference except the sign when you go in, okay? But the ignorance, and I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, but the true ignorance, meaning they don't know what they don't know, okay? They have no reference point for rural life. They just don't. And so they kept passing policies that just didn't make sense for rural areas. The best example I can give you, and you might remember it, I don't know, it's been 3 or 4 years ago now. At the time, the chancellor, now she's the commissioner of education, but Betty Rosa had a proposal that all substitute teachers would have to be certified in the area that they were going to sub in. Okay? And the reason for that was because in New York City, they were getting subpar substitutes, and they had behavioral issues, and they did not have a good experience with their substitutes, right? Well, I had to point out to them that we can't get certified teachers, period, permanent staff. So how in the world do you think we're going to find people sitting at home waiting for a Thursday to roll around when they need a chemistry teacher and they happen to be qualified in that? Okay? It doesn't exist in rural areas. And they pulled it. They pulled the proposal, right? So a lot of this has to do with simply giving accurate information to people who need that information to make sound policies. It doesn't necessarily have to be political. We just need people to be informed, right? So we did this, and I wrote this, and I prepared to make a big deal about that and tell people what a raw deal people in rural areas were getting. And then right as I was going to do that, the pandemic hit, and everybody had a raw deal, and I wouldn't have gotten any press whatsoever. So I waited until we were coming out of the pandemic, and we got tremendous traction with it. I was talking with Mark, and our conference last summer, you know, the first deputy commissioner holding this up in his hand, talking about, you know, this all means all, you know, every kid has to be recognized, and the kids in rural areas are important. And that was the first time I had ever heard somebody in authority in our state make that statement. Right? It's part of our culture, I think, in rural areas that will, if it has to be done, we'll do it ourselves. Okay? We'll put the wagons in a circle, and we're resourceful, and we're creative, and we'll use what we've got, and we'll make do, and we'll get this thing done. And I think some of the consequence of that, and I think he's absolutely right, part of it's politics. You lose that many people out of an area of New York State, and your political clout diminishes dramatically simply because of the numbers of representatives that you lose in that discussion. And the shift, it's, you know, this isn't about politics, except that everything's about politics. And the fact of the matter is that rural New York is Republican, and the Democrats control both houses and the governor's office. And so you've got to find a way to get your needs just in the discussion. Okay? When I worked particularly in the Senate staff has tremendous autonomy. If a bill came across, particularly as Home Rule Council, it's a provision of New York State's Constitution that says you can't pass a law about something to a particular town without their permission. Public education's an exception, along with trivia that only I know because it only mattered to me at the time, right? It's public education, taxation, the police power, and the judiciary. Those are the only areas that override it. Otherwise, you got to ask. If you want to pass a law just for Plattsburgh, you can't do it without Plattsburgh's permission, right? And the way you do that is they all meet in a caucus, and the staff gets up and explains it to them. And then the way an idea gets any traction is some senator will stand up and say, I've been hearing about this every day in my district. I need to have something done about this. And then if somebody else stands up and echoes and says, me too, I had to ask them to call off the dogs because at the time, my fax machine was burning up, right? If you don't have anybody that stands up and says, hey, in my district, this is a big problem and we've got to do something about it, it just dies, okay? They go on to other things. And their reference point, their concern, the majority of the majority, in the assembly in particular, is from the city, right? So trying to get the information to them in a form that lets them understand the problem, and you know, this is my motto for the past 30 years. You never give a state leader a problem without telling them what to do about it. And that's not, you know, it's not being critical of their ability to assess it, but in public education, we're so passionate about that one area that we forget about some of the other people that are walking into their office right after us. You know, people trying to meet the needs of disabled veterans and seniors that need to be housed. And I mean, there are all kinds of farmers that need, everybody, roads and bridges that may fall in. Okay? There are lots of legitimate state interests, and everybody's got somebody that's going in there to try and make their case. So we have to enter that mix, and we can't endorse, we can't give volunteers, we can't give money to campaigns. So what can we do? We can be a resource for them when they're trying to come up with the solutions. Okay? If the problems become evident, we can be the ones that tell them what they need to do about it, what will work. And sometimes it's just about stating the obvious. We've been trying to figure out forever, what do we do about the problem of rural schools not having a broad enough curriculum to allow their graduates to be competitive with urban and suburban graduates? For as long as I've been around, that's been an issue. And it's particularly acute right now. Well, every single state that surrounds New York State has addressed that problem for 2 generations with regional high schools. I live outside of Albany, and I can get to the Mount Greylock Regional High School that's it's outside of Pittsfield in Massachusetts, and I can get to the Bennington Regional High School in Bennington, Vermont, quicker than I can get to my office in Albany. They're right there. And we have 4 of them in New York, but they're only on Long Island. And we haven't figured out how to make it work in New York. To me, it's a solution just waiting to be tapped, because in my estimation, humble estimation, the New York State legislature has had one brilliant idea in the time that I've been associated with them. And that brilliant idea was, I'm a Buckeye. I was born on the Ohio State campus, the Ohio State University, right? And the reason they say that, believe it or not, is not out of arrogance. It's because there are a lot of Ohio State universities, Akron and Kent State and Ohio University. There's a boatload of them. But there's one big centralized campus that they call the Ohio State University, right? New York went in exactly the opposite direction. You can't go farther than 30 miles anywhere in this state without hitting either a community college or a SUNY campus. Okay? Tremendous resource spread throughout the state. Okay? And they're hurting for students. And we need a place and a structure. And why we aren't having BOCES work with community colleges and SUNY campuses to host regional high schools. I went to 2 of them. My dad taught at Illinois State University. I went to U-High, University High School, run by Illinois State University. Okay? Then my dad went on sabbatical when I was on 8th grade, and all of my colleagues, my fellow students in that little tiny K through 8 district were anticipating the next year going to E.O. Smith High School, run by UConn on the University of Connecticut's campus. Right? It's a model that's been around forever, and we haven't figured it out. So part of this is about trying to figure out and then make known what works. So we're going to create a document that's similar to this once we've identified the issues that we have and offer whatever suggestions we can. And then we're going to start to work those solutions into policies as best we can by having the meetings and the information and the communications that'll that'll at least make me sleep at night knowing that they've got the information if they want to use it, and hopefully they will. We already have Shelley Mayer, who is the chair of the Senate Education Committee, has got a bill that has many of our solutions that came out of this, and the Commissioner of Education is being very supportive of some of the ideas that we've had so far, and that's found its way into proposals that they've made. So all of which is to say that we're taking this seriously. Okay, I'm not doing this just because I love the view between Albany and here. And Terry has agreed, the reason we're doing this is not only do we need to record your comments, obviously, but you need to know that we're recording your comments, so that you understand that we're being serious about this, and we want to be able to use these as we put together the next iteration of this document, whatever it's called. So that's what we're here for, okay? It's a unique time. I've never lived through a time like this before. It's really extraordinary. The pandemic did a lot of things. It tore all of us down and made us reform and figure out how to be better as we went forward. For rural schools in particular, it created license to be tremendously creative. Okay? The state education department has done a 180 and basically went from an agency that was largely interested in regulating to one that's interested in collaborating. And I've actually heard the first deputy commissioner say, tell your people to ask for forgiveness afterwards and not permission beforehand, right? Figure out the best way to deal with what you're dealing with, because, all bets were off. When the pandemic started and as we went through it, nobody knew. Nobody had a clue how to do that. We'd never done it in our lifetimes before. I found it tremendously ironic that 110 years ago we had a big pandemic and the only thing we had was to stay away from each other and wear masks. And 108 years later, that's basically what we had again, right? We didn't have much else going for us at the time, and so they said, we don't know what to do either, but we know what we need you to do. We need you to get information out there. We need you to feed people that aren't getting food otherwise. We need you to do daycare for first responders, all of those kind of things. And so schools, more than ever, became the central focus of the community. They've always been a cultural focus, an economic engine within a small community. I drove through, I wish I had paid attention at the time because I was just driving home, and it was a community just south of Letchworth State Park out by Rochester. And I went through the town and I thought, man, the recession has decimated this place. There wasn't a car, there wasn't a person. I couldn't see any evidence of life in their little downtown area. And then I got a mile outside of town and I had to go like 5 miles an hour because there were cars on both sides of I was at the school, and there were cars on both sides, and there were kids playing outside and people going into the school for something else. And obviously that community centered around its school. And so it's made us basically the disseminator of whatever needs to be done for all people, for all things. Okay? And particularly, I think, as we've come out of the pandemic and have that experience, we have an opportunity now. I mean, think about this. When have we ever had a state investment in education like we have right now? When have we ever had a federal investment like the rescue money that came for us? At the same time that the state education department has basically said, hey, use it as best you can, try and fix this thing. Okay? What an opportunity. The enormity of it is startling. We can talk about the looming recession off in the future. We can talk about the fiscal cliff once the money wears out from the federal government, all of those types of things. But the fact of the matter is, all of those things have come together at once, and we've got a chance to do something to address some of the historic needs in our rural areas. You can see that we're swimming upstream in this thing. Just give you a couple examples. Terry's working on teacher retention, and they're doing teacher retention and recruitment at our summer conference, right? Well, other states have got a lot of programs, including things like loan forgiveness if you teach in a high-need rural area. Well, New York State's got that program for urban teachers. Okay, if you teach in a high-need urban area, you can get help with your student loans, not if you teach in a high-need rural area, right? And so we've got work to do, I guess is the shortest way to say that. We've got work to do to make them aware and to make them care. I always say, I give them theories, but only you guys can make them care, right? Because at least in terms of schools, you've got the only things they really care about, their kids and their money, right? So if we do our work, hopefully we'll be able to get some real traction, and we have. We've gotten real traction with the first iteration of this, and we want to build on that. So with that, I'll finally stop bludgeoning you with this information and start to hear from you about the kind of things that you're facing right now, the things that you're afraid of facing, and if you have a suggestion for what to do about it, we'd obviously love to hear that too. We'll get it up on the board and eventually into the document. Okay? So, with that, who wants to be the intrepid first person to start mouthing off?
I'm Donna Watt with the BOCES board here, and I represent the town of Ticonderoga on the board. Our local schools down there have taken so many hits. Our tax situation is completely messed up. They are really being held to their 2% cap right now because the ratio of what town pays for how much of our school system is totally messed up. From an agreement back in the 70s, the residents are in turmoil now about what to do with a current reassessment that's making it worse. We're not going to get any more tax dollars out of our folks down there. Every single year, we let attrition take its course with programs and teachers to try and make our budget balance, and it does not help. Every single year, it gets worse. We no longer have hardly any AP programs. Our AP programs are up here. We're having to bus our kids up to Mineville in order to get AP courses for the New Visions programs up there. We have no more AP programs in our school. How do you prepare kids to go out in the world to compete in college, any of that without those programs? Our athletic programs, decimated. We have to go to the community and ask them to pitch in for equipment, things like that. Decimated. Our music programs, our art programs, decimated. We are operating down there on the absolute minimum curriculum and teachers that we can. How do we get real dollars down into our school system that we can count on year after year to have these programs that have been over a decade disappearing?
Sometimes I will respond, and sometimes I'll just let your question hang there. This one I'll give a short answer to, because there are a couple of suggestions that are out there, and you usually don't have to go much farther than some sister state who has a program in place already. In this case, it's California. California has a category within their aid formula called small but essential schools. And what it means is, it's not just that you're small, it's that we don't know how to replace you effectively. Okay, we don't know how to educate your kids without you. Okay, you're either geographically isolated. You know, the example up here that I would use was Newcomb. Okay, Newcomb brought in international students because, you know, you couldn't cross the lake and you couldn't go over the mountains to try and merge with somebody, right? You'd shut down half the winter to try and get buses back and forth, right? So California has decided to acknowledge that. If you got to have it, you can't systematically say that these kids are going to be undereducated because they happen to live in a geographically isolated or a small school. Okay? So that they just have a sparsity indicator. We have a sparsity indicator in ours, but it's not determinative. It's not effective in driving enough toward the problem. So I'm sure there are other responses. Regionalism being the other thing. one of my favorite movies is Hook, you know, and in Hook, Captain Hook is pacing back and forth, and Mr. Smee comes over, his first mate. He comes over and says, "Captain, I've had an apostrophe," you know, and Hook rolls his eyes and says, "I think you mean an epiphany," right? So every once in a while, you get an epiphany in one of these things. And, you know, there are things like the community schools concept. Community schools is an urban concept, but it uses the local, whatever partners happen to be local to you. In rural areas, it might not be more than the community college or the SUNY campus or the county services agencies, right? You might not have a boys and girls club or, you know, or things like that they have in urban areas. But the idea is to use that extra space that was built out and the loss of enrollment that you've experienced that creates more space to do more things out of that facility. You know, Bassett Health has school-based health centers now throughout the southern tier. I don't know, there's a couple of dozen of them now, right? So there are things that can be done, and schools get, community schools aid, but it's not a set-aside, you know, and most schools have been forced because of their lack of funding to use that money as general aid to try and restore some of the things that they've cut. So there are ideas out there, but I don't think the state's really zeroed in on any one in particular. The regional high school thing is just, to me, it's intriguing because NYSET was always opposed to the concept because they thought they would lose staff. You put four high schools into a regional high school, you don't need 4 history teachers anymore, you need 1. And they were always afraid they would lose those teachers. Well, we've lost 10,000 teachers. How many more could we possibly lose, right? And I would say even put it into the law, you lose no one. The idea is not to make it, because there's study after study that says regionalizing doesn't save money, but it can broaden the curriculum, because now you have 4 history teachers to teach AP history, you know, to teach 4 different aspects that would end up making rural kids as competitive as their suburban counterparts. The part that's really difficult, you know, the things that keep me up, right? Rural schools graduate well over 90% of kids. Okay, that's not the problem. The problem is that 75% of those kids, 75%, never get a 2-year, a 4-year, or even a certificate after they get out of high school. Okay, it's abysmal. It's an indictment of the system. And it's not tough to figure out why that is either, because they haven't had the coursework. They get to even a community college, what's the first thing they hear? You're going to have to take remedial work to get you caught up to where you'll have the breadth of understanding for you to be able to take the college level work. So they can go upwards of a year taking courses that are in remediation, and they thought they were going to college to learn about what they wanted to do, what they were interested in, and they don't touch that stuff for months, right? And they're paying for the privilege, and they're trying to figure out how to get there over some fairly long, inconvenient distances. And they don't have a staff to help them fill out a FAFSA form or any of that type of stuff, because the school doesn't have the resources to do that. So the odds are stacked, you know, when they go there. And I had a really encouraging call. If you get a chance, look online at a company called Level All. And Level All is backed by some pretty big entities, Target and Bloomberg and others. And their concept is to level the playing field, particularly for rural kids, to try and get them to the same place and to have a plan from before high school to work themselves through this to college and beyond. Doesn't have to be college. It can be a career. It can be the military. It can be anything but your parents' couch in the basement, right? That's what we're fighting, is the parents' couch in the basement, right? So take a look if you get a chance. But, you know, that's why I let a lot of the questions hang, because I'll spout off. You
Didn't mean
know,
to get you started.
yeah, I know.
But you hit it all.
I know. You,
Yep.
you wound me up, and I apologize. So,
So,
yeah, go ahead.
so we have lots of new technologies coming down the pipe over the last 20 years, and they keep coming faster and faster. So I personally don't know much about like Chat GPT and AI and how those resources are actually going to help or hurt us. And I'm kind of interested in having being able to learn more about it. So I don't know if that's something that you might consider adding to your discussion for the summer conference. How is this going to impact our kids? Is it a good thing? What's bad about it? Those are some of the things that are coming up down the pipe that I'm interested in, and I imagine a lot of other folks are curious.
Well, I think you kind of hit the nail on the head, because the title, the tagline for this summer's conference is "The Rural Reality from the Middle of Nowhere to the Heart of Everything." Okay? And Mark actually got me started on this, because he told me the story of his married couple. They're both vice presidents for KeyBank that are living in the Keene Valley out of Manhattan. And once they had broadband, they were able to do that, and they wanted a different kind of upbringing for their kids than Manhattan, right? The possibilities, once broadband has in fact reached everybody, and there is a federal mandate that happen, and it's one of the most encouraging things. Now, as you say, whether that 100 years from now people look back and decide that was the start of the downfall of the great empire, you know, but for at least the short term, you know, again, tough to shut me up, and I apologize. But during the pandemic, I was thinking about what would I have done as a child? If this were happening to me when I was growing up, what would my day have been like? Well, the first thing that would have happened was I would have gotten a packet from school. There were no computers, so I would have gotten a packet of work to do from the school. And I would have done that work, and then I just know I would have gone outside, and I would have stayed far enough away, but I'd be riding bikes, and I'd be playing baseball, and I'd still see my friends, right? Because I lived in a neighborhood, okay? And our parents, you know, they might have been home, they might not, but we had landlines, and everybody had a phone, and you would have talked to people, and you would have played with people still, and you would have come out of the pandemic, you know, not socially restrained, right? Now think about what happened to the rural kids during the pandemic. They're miles away from their friends. They can't walk every day, you know, to go see them. If mom and dad are there, they're the ones on the computer, if you had a computer, and you probably didn't, and you might not have had cell service. And if they weren't there and they had the car at work, you were stuck there, okay? 2 years of, in essence, like isolation, solitary confinement. And those 2 years, if your school was off for the full 2 years, I mean, not operating in person for those 2 years, we literally had kids go from elementary to high school. Never went to what the equivalent would have been of junior high, right? And we wonder why we're seeing behaviors that are socially retarded, for lack of a better word, okay? They simply didn't know any better. They developed at the rate that the circumstances allowed them to develop. So really tough. So if in fact we have the ability, it could be the great leveler. You know, certainly digital learning had the capacity to bring coursework to rural areas that they'd never had the financial ability to offer in person. And the scary part of it, the reason why I'm so hesitant when I talk about this thing, is I can't get a video out of my mind. I went to the AASA, the Superintendent's National Association. I went to hear Bill Daggett speak one time, and Bill has spoken at our conference a number of times. And Bill played a video for everybody, and it was an MIT engineer being interviewed by 60 Minutes. And this guy had this monstrous looking thing over his ear and down his jawline. And the interviewer was asking him the most arcane questions you can think about. What's the third highest mountain in Bolivia, and what's the population of the village at the bottom of it? And he would say 12,557 feet and 3,027 people at the bottom of the hill. Yeah, what's the average wage there? And he would say it. And he didn't know any of that stuff. But that device was not telling him the answers in his ear. It was implanting it in his brain. So he was saying the answers in real time, no hesitation. He wasn't waiting to hear the answer and then speak it. He knew at the instant the device heard the question, the device was implanting the answer. And the MIT engineer that was being interviewed said, you give me 10 years and this device will be that big and it'll be 2 inches down in your kid's ear and you'll never know whether they're wearing it or not. So why are you teaching them content? Because they'll know everything the day they walk in the door. Right? He said, your job is going to be to teach them how to use it, how to collaborate, how to communicate, how to work with other people, the social structure that you're going to use that, how to have ethics around having that kind of information, right? I mean, think of the consequences of that. It's one thing to have a 4-year-old know-it-all, you know? But when they truly know it all, that's completely different animal, okay? So, you know, wise use of what's going to be available to us, I think will be what makes or breaks America. You know, something broke the ancient Romans, broke the Greeks, something eventually breaks, you know? Yeah, go ahead, Dave.
Hi, David. So pleased that you're up here this evening. Appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Yeah.
My name is Dale Brielt. I'm the district superintendent from Franklin, Essex, Hamilton, Boces, a little bit to our west of here. And, you know, when we talk about rural issues, I vacillate back and forth between considering this an economic development issue. You know, it would be great if we could encourage much more economic development back in our rural communities so that the families and the children would come back and would start to fill our schools up again. So that's one thing that, you know, oftentimes I feel we really should be working on. And, you know, secondly, and you mentioned it, we have to oftentimes accept the reality that we have and think about things like regionalization. And, but one of the things I struggle with is, in that regard, is if you want to pick a fight in any one of our small rural communities, you know, go and start asking, why do you need a town and a village in the same community? And, and a separate fire district and a separate ambulance district, and then you have the county. You know, someone told me years ago that, you know, New York State, you know, we're so fiercely dedicated to local control, and I believe if you count up all the municipalities, including school districts, fire districts, towns, villages, there's over 10,000 in New York State. So if we can't even consolidate a town and a village in a community that probably doesn't have a need for either one of them in many ways, you know, we can't even do that. So these communities just struggle with this concept of regionalization because we're so fiercely dedicated to these strong, independent, local entities that we have here in New York State. So I throw those out there as some of the challenges that we need to get people to come to grips with.
Well, I hate to say this, but you just rang my bell. That's my wheelhouse. I'm the former local government counsel for the Senate. Every one of those districts had to go through me. Okay, so I know that issue better than any other. But I can also tell you that the world's foremost location for shared services is here. Okay, any other place in the world is second to where we are right here. And when you think about it, we have so many different levels of, we want to keep the village fire department and we want to keep the town fire, and it's usually not a fire department because none of us can afford any of that. Those are volunteers, but we've all got plow trucks. Okay, the state comes through and the town comes through and the village comes through and everybody's got a plow truck. And, you know, but the good news in all of that is we have 3 different levels of cooperation. We've got a formal level. You know, we've got school buses and the county's got plow trucks. Why don't we go together and build a fueling depot? right? And you just put in your credit card like you're going to the local gas station, and we'll know who to charge, and, you know, we don't need 2 of these, we only need 1 of it. And then you've got, or we'll build a municipal garage to fix diesels, because we've all got diesel engines, right? And then we've got informal stuff, you know, which is, sure, you can use our fields for your summer camp if you'll plow our parking lot in the winter for us. Okay, so we've got those handshake agreements. And then superimposed on the whole thing that nobody else has is we've got the BOCES system that financially incentivizes us to share services, right? So we've got all of those, and your list was not exhaustive. There are lighting districts, sewer districts, you know, water districts, there, you name it. There's a district for it someplace, and they're all municipalities. You know, it's one of our secrets. School districts are municipal entities, just like a county, just like a town. You're an independent taxing jurisdiction in New York. That's why you vote on the budget, and your local school board members as trustees, just like you vote on town council, all of that kind of stuff. You know, it's because you're a municipal entity. The other part of that, though, which brings us back to policy, is that the reason school districts are municipalities is because the state has determined that that's how it wants to uphold, that's the system the state wants to use to uphold its constitutional responsibility of providing education for everybody, okay? We can't do it from Albany, so we're gonna set up these local jurisdictions everywhere to be able to provide this, which is why when we say we're all for local control, you gotta say, yeah, but if you're gonna scream about the fact that they're not doing it right, you have to acknowledge that it's their responsibility to do it. So when we get situations like Ticonderoga, where you can say, how can you, it's unconscionable what you're doing. You're allowing children to be, I mean, Shelter Island's spending $100,000 per child, and Ticonderoga is struggling to meet the bare minimum state requirement for graduation, right? Let alone any extra. And we're calling both of those the equivalent of a sound basic education, right? So your zip code in New York determines how you do that. In virtually every other state, it's the mirror opposite of what New York is. Every other state, the state pays for 60% of public education, and if you have the resources, you can go above that. But the state is going to provide what it costs to do that sound basic education, okay? If you're really wealthy, you can provide well above that, but the baseline, there's in many states, there's a state mandated base teacher salary, and then you negotiate from there, all that type of thing. But it's 60-40, okay? New York State pays about 35%. Okay, so it's virtually switched. We say, yeah, how many times did you hear Andrew Cuomo crow about the fact that we spend more on average per child than any other state? And that was the classic example of 1 foot in boiling water and 1 foot in ice water, and saying on average we feel pretty good. Because you've got Shelter Island and Westchester County and many of the Long Island districts on one hand, and then you've got districts that have had the candle cut at both ends. Not only are they getting insufficient state aid, but then you've got a state policy that says even if we wanted to overtax our local residents, and I call it doing the hard work of staying, you know, the people who stay have the toughest job of all, because fewer and fewer people have more and more of not only the financial, but the day-to-day responsibility thrust on them. You know, I see it in the little country church I go to. As the people who have always been there are no longer able to attend, the few of us that are still upright and mobile end up doing, you know, there's only like half a dozen people that are physically capable of doing whatever needs to be done at any given time. So that's what happens when you get, and I've got a highfalutin term for it, you know, the hydraulic descending centrifugal force of the porcelain receptacle. Right? Ask any goldfish how that works out. Right? So when you get down to a certain number, that's why I was so concerned about the outward migration, because when you get that core number of people down to fewer, you don't have a lot to work with, particularly financially. So the last thing in the world you want to do if you've got people leaving and people determining whether or not they're able to stay is say, yeah, well, the state's not doing its job, so we need to tax you at 10% more next year, right? So those taxes are restrained, and yet the state hasn't figured out how to do this. That's why this is it's why I'm doing this. This unique opportunity comes at the same time that they fully funded the foundation aid formula, okay? It took them a generation to do it. It literally took them the entire length of time, from the time the court ordered them to do it to the time they're going to fulfill it, took them the entire length of a child's education from kindergarten through senior year, okay? Well, once everybody's fully funded, that means nobody's on the formula anymore. The formula is useless because nobody's on it, okay? The criterion is a generation old. When they wrote that formula, student mental health wasn't a consideration. That's not in the formula. Migration patterns are not in the formula. English language learners are not in the formula. You name it, and we've got a different society that we're living in than at the turn of the century, right? So they've got to do something for the next generation. They've got to create a new formula, which is why getting them accurate information about what might need to go into that formula is so important. Yeah, Wayne.
Wayne Rogers, Malone School Board. Some of you probably recognize me too, and I'm the visitor board for Area 6. But I want to talk about AP, because we've been talking about this a lot in our board meetings over the last few weeks. Obviously, COVID was not very kind to AP courses. And what we noticed was that there's been a diminishment of numbers of courses taught, and also number of students in these courses. We really wrangled over this over the last two board meetings, to the point that some people were saying, well, we have dual enrollment courses, and that allows us to make sure that a student gets credit for English or other courses that they'll take with them to college. But we also have people in our community that know that as a point of equity, there's a difference between AP and the dual enrollment courses. So this is what we've come to, and I'm not sure whether this would fit into Cooperstown or not, but we've come to the idea that A, we have one distance learning room, 3 periods of the day, which means most of the morning it's done with American Sign Language, because we have an excellent sign language instructor, and of course that's a very popular distance learning course. So we're trying to figure out, well, how are we going to have more courses for not just our students, but other students? And the answer we're going to look into now is portable distance learning units. I don't know where this is going to go, because this is something that just sprung upon us over the last 10 days. But it might be something that would fit into Cooperstown, if that's something that is doable, because I don't think anybody on our board had any idea that distance learning could be anywhere other than in that one room. That was the only place it could be. Also, with a portable unit, you can have a teacher and a student right within your district. Your teacher really is a valuable commodity when he or she is teaching a distance learning course. So I think that's, to me, I pulled out, sometimes I say the right things. I pulled out an on-board from a year and a half ago, and what it said was that this area is the second lowest percentage of students enrolled in AP courses. And the enrollment tends to be in the wealthier areas of our area. For example, in St. Lawrence County, we've got Canton. Canton is in a strategic location, lots of support, colleges. They have multiple AP courses. If you look at the percentages, about 60% of our districts in North Country offer AP courses, and they serve about 8% of the total students in the North Country. So while they're serving 8% of the total students, what's really happening is they're taking care of their students. They're not able to take care of your students. But it's something that has to happen. COVID kicked the rug out from under us in terms of being able to provide AP because nobody wanted to risk teaching it, and students didn't want to risk taking it. They're going to take the AP test the first week of May, and what kind of instruction can you have when it's all through a Zoom? Thanks.
Yeah, well, I think you're right. Obviously, you know, technology has the ability to change the field, and I think it also has the ability to change the expectations. You know, I think a lot of the variation has to do with the expectation that parents have for the path that their kids will take, and there are glitches in the system. I mean, let's face it. There is not excellent coordination between lower ed and higher ed in many cases. My wife absolutely hates when I do this, but everybody says that their kids are their pride and joy. I've got 2 boys, and I say I've got one of each. Right? The older one, who's the managing attorney for Salino Law in Rochester, graduated high school with 30 college credits, and colleges wouldn't take the credits. Right? So, you know, it's tough. You know, anybody that talked to Patrick after he graduated, what's Patrick going to tell them what that's worth for them to take the time and effort? You know, he took the time and effort, and it was worth nothing beyond just the knowledge that he gained from taking those courses, right? My younger son, who's the photographer for the Hampshire Daily Gazette over in the Berkshires, and the most joyful soul I've ever met in my life. But he didn't want to go to RIT. He wanted to go to Ithaca College because he's a creative kid, and his interest in photography was creative. You know, RIT told him how to make a camera. You know, I mean, that was the difference in the approach. And it wasn't the place for him. But when he interviewed at Ithaca, they flat out told him, they said, Danny, we can't take you because you haven't had the breadth of courses. They said from the first day here, you're going to be puzzled because you don't have a context to put this information in. So we're going to give you information in the first day of class, and you're going to run back to your room and try and find out how to understand what we just told you, while the rest of the class is figuring out what the assignment is so they're prepared for the next day. So you're going to come in understanding the first day, but you're not going to be ready for the second day, and that's going to compound until it takes you forever to get out of here, right? And they were right. You know, they were right. And he graduated with A's from my alma mater, where I was the school board president. So this is on me. But we were, at the time, we were rated the top school, not just the top rural school, but the top school. The Capital District Business Review covers all of the schools in this corner of the state, including up here, and we were the top one. And that's how bad we screwed up as number one. Okay? So I think you're absolutely right, but I think we've got to, that's why I wanted higher ed folks within our conversation, because we've got work to do. They've got concerns too. My dad was head of teacher education at Russell Sage, and particularly special ed. He was a pioneer in special ed. And, you know, he had to retire for medical reasons, but he was very frustrated by the end of his career. He said, this college, in order to survive, is taking students who I have to make teachers who don't come here reading and writing. Right? He said, how do I do that? I'm trying to, especially special ed teachers. He said, I need to be able to specialize them. I can't start from scratch and get a specialist. You know, you can't teach somebody to be a heart surgeon that hasn't been to med school first, you know? So it's, you know, as a society, it's something I think that we've got to work on. And certainly certainly technology, and I think I'll harken back to what I said before. I think our basic structure of the way we located public entities, in particular higher educational entities, and the fact that we have a BOCES structure who knows how to transport kids regionally and do things electronically. I think the merger of those two things to try and bring us an educational system that could bring a far broader array of high school courses to kids that would make that transition to higher ed or even career, because this isn't just about college. This is about kids coming out of high school and the technical expertise or the trade-related expertise that they need. They have to be able to make that transition as well. So, yeah, and then over here.
No,
You got it? Okay.
I totally agree. Students are a high barrier for Board of Education. Students are our first priority, and some of the points we've made up there, but they are, and we need to be able to have the ability to address those things to prepare our students for the future. But we also have to deal with mandates from the state. One huge mandate that is looming over us, as you talked about sharing diesel fuel. Yes, we share diesel fuel already in our district with our town. Electric buses. In 2027, we're supposed to be going into purchasing electric buses. We have about 40 buses in our fleet. Okay, they aren't made. They're 3 times the cost. They only go 150 miles from what I've read recently, and I hope that will improve. But one of our homes can be almost 20 miles to the home, 20 miles back, and then we do a second bus run. So you got 80 miles on that bus. And what's going to happen in the cold? So I think rural schools have to address this. What do we do with this electric bus piece that we've got to start buying them in 2027? They aren't being made. Our grid probably isn't prepared for them. We have to put in the charging stations. I'm not even sure what the charging station cost is. And as we're going and looking at a facilities plan, that's one of the big costs that's going to happen, is that we have to have a charging station for every bus. And we'll have to have them for buses, Ticonderoga comes up, and Ticonderoga comes up for sports in our area. They're going to have a charging station to go back down. 3 times the amount of cost. They're not being built right now. We have to do it by 2027 to start buying them and have them a fleet by 2035. Well, that gives us 8 years for 40 buses at 5 buses a year to have our community buy them. There's a huge expense for the community. I think we've got the cart a little bit before the horse. Can we get realistic, and can the Rural Schools Association help us advocate for some reality in what we're doing? I believe it's totally the way to go, but let's get some reality in.
Way ahead of you. Way ahead of you. And the reason is because the press recognized early on that difficulties with electrification of buses was going to be most severe where you've got the greatest distances involved, right? And you can't take a 60-seat bus and have 10 seats for kids and the rest is batteries, right? The first thing that happened was DOT said, do you have any idea how much electric buses are going to weigh and what that's going to do to the roads? That was the first thing I heard, and so I had to get an education about this issue really quick, because this truly was the state doing an if you build it, they will come decision, right? We're going to name a date that it has to be, and the industry, because when they created the idea, when it first was listed in the State of the State address, you're absolutely right. There wasn't a bus in existence that could handle it at that time. There is now. There is a bus. They stick out the end of any existing bus garage. They're too long for existing bus garages. One of the things I would tell you to do is to talk to, and I'm not hawking anybody's services, but there's a company called Highland. And I've heard them present twice now just on how to manage this transition. They don't sell buses and that type of stuff. They help manage the transition. They'll do, like on performance contracting, they know you can, if you only put in, you say, we've got to put in 2 charging stations a year, right? They'll put in 20 and front the money for you because you're going to have all 20 before it's over, and it's more cost effective to do 20 than to do it piecemeal, that type of thing. So they've had to look at the logistics of this thing and determine whether it's possible, you know? And I think 2 things will probably have to happen. But first I will tell you that at the time that it was said, I would bet my entire career's experience that the leaders had no idea whether what they were requiring would actually be possible at the time that it had to be done, okay? They were projecting as well and being aspirational about what would be done. And the reason I say that is because they didn't have a funding source. If you'll recall, when they first said it, when they started, they said $500 million will be included in the Environmental Bond Act to help pay for this if the public supports the Environmental Bond Act. They never said what happens if the public doesn't support the Environmental Bond Act. So if the public hadn't supported that, they wouldn't have even the $500 million of seed money, which is what they're operating on to try and create this program, to try and do the work of figuring out what kind of a structure will be needed statewide to try and make this work. And obviously, you know, if you happen to live on a 118-mile long, 20-mile wide island with 127 school districts, you can probably figure this out pretty easily. If you've got a school district that's 500 square miles, you know, you've got to wait for the industry to catch up a little bit before you start buying a bunch of those buses for the reasons that you stated. So it's going to take some work, but I will tell you that personally, this isn't professional opinion now, but I started in to be a school board member because I knew the state that my personal school was in at the time, and my kids were about ready to start school, right? And one of the first things that I saw when I had a meeting during the day with our administrative team, I came out at the time that the kindergartners through 2nd graders were lining up to go home, which means both of my boys were sitting in a line that was lined up on the sidewalk, nose to tailpipe, with diesel buses running, okay, every day, okay? That's got to change, okay? Whether or not it changes by elevating the tailpipes like municipal buses have, I mean, there are other solutions, natural gas, there are lots of things that could be done about this, and it's a state policy that has to, you know, I mean, they've got to select what to do. They've chosen to do this, and now the national administration has done much the same thing with cars and proposed having deadlines and a timeline for a conversion to cars. I don't think that the big oil companies have weighed in about that yet, you know, but we'll see how that plays out. But I think they recognize that the first thing to do in getting people to think that it's possible and it's going to happen, so we might as well jump in and try and make it happen, is to tell them that it's going to happen. You know, if you say, this is going to happen by a certain date, that's going to be our policy, and you have to comply, that's a different thing than somebody saying, hey, let's all get together and see if we can get electric buses by 2035. And everybody will have the practical reaction, well, that's ridiculous, right? We can't afford to do that. And I think the biggest impediment out of all the capabilities of buses and charging and all that type of thing, the biggest impediment will be state funding. Because the state can't possibly expect that the districts that will be hit hardest with the longest distances to go are many times the most impoverished districts in the state that have no local tax base, have no ability to pay 3 times, let alone for the charging stations. And there are unintended consequences as well. Those depots that we have out there, if you no longer need a fueling depot full of diesel bus, NCON's got some ideas about how to get that out of there, and it's not just yank it up out of the ground, okay? And there are costs associated with that nobody has said boo about yet, you know? So we've got lots to figure out, 12 years, I guess, to figure it out. But what they have succeeded in doing is creating companies that are like, we can make a boatload by getting in on the front end of this thing. And so things will be possible. So our saying, we can't possibly do that. No, they'll make it possible for you to do that. I think the industry will rise to the occasion. Whether policymakers will make it affordable and possible, in terms of, it won't be impossible, but will it be workable? Will it be financially viable? That's a question for other than the industry to answer. Yeah.
Richard Harriman, Senior, BOCES board member, and I represent NYS as well. I live in the northwestern part of Clinton County, where we have two windmill projects. When the first one came to town, which was Noble, now another name, I was doing electrical work for them and talking with the guy from GE, their head man that was setting up a triple wide trailer. And he said, Rick, every place that we've gone, the schools have gone from mediocre to top-notch because of the extra money that's going into the towns. Well, lo and behold, the state in their influence said, we can't have these schools, they've got windmills, be better than the others. So we're just gonna take that money and mold it into the state aid. So, here we are trying to do a budget. We could have had all kinds of extra money, and they won't let us have it. They take it back one way or another or anything. So if we had a chance to get ahead, they don't give us the opportunity. So that needs to change. We get pilot payments, but again, it goes right into the budget.
I don't know what the circumstances are now. I don't know how long it takes anymore. But it used to take the state 3 years from the time that you told them that you'd had a change in financial circumstances to the time that they changed your aid formula to reflect those circumstances. And usually it's the opposite. Usually it's IBM leaves Poughkeepsie and they don't get any more state aid, right? They just lost half their tax base. Or think about when NYMO sold off all of their power plants for a couple $100,000 a piece, right? And everybody screamed, those are multi-million-dollar power plants, right? And they'll say, well, we'll show you comparable sales because we're selling all of them, and we're selling them all for $200,000 because they didn't want to be in the business anymore, right? So all those school districts lost half their tax base overnight when they all shut down, right? And just because NYMO said we're going to be in the transmission business, not the production business for power anymore. And when that happened, those districts have been hurting ever since. The state never said, well, we need to make up that income. They said, we'll use the formula, and according to the wealth that you still have, and according to the number of students you have, and according to that 76-page formula, and I don't want to take up all of the conversation, but I will tell you one story, because it's my contention, and has been in speeches forever, that we've done everything with that state aid formula except use it. Okay, and I've been around for every year that it's been in existence. We've frozen it, we've cut it, we've delegitimized it, but we've never let it run. And this is the story I use to prove it. And I won't use the staff member's name, and I won't use the senator's name, but I used to share administrative staff with the guy who did state aid for the Senate, and he went on to do it for Governor Pataki. The only other guy in the Capital Region, besides my father-in-law, that went to my alma mater, my college alma mater, Wittenberg, out in Ohio. But he ran the state aid formula, and his office was about this big, and it was nothing but tables, and all over those tables were stacks of paper this high. And I used to trade off, because I was school board president. I'd go in and I'd find out early what Brittenkill was going to get, right? And in exchange for that, I'd let him sleep on my couch in my office because he couldn't go home. He didn't have enough time to go home and get sleep, so he'd come and sleep on the couch for the 2 hours he had before he had to get back in, and his office was filled with tables, so he didn't have a place for it, right? So I went in there one night, because we had to stay. If anybody was there, we all had to stay. So I went over into the office, and I said, we'll call him Bob, because that's not his name. It's all right. So I said, Bob, what are you doing? Senator so-and-so needs this district to get this amount of money, and I have to work this thing backwards so that I know what to put in on the first page to get that number at the end. So he was going down the state aid formula is 76 pages long. He was working it backwards over 76 pages to know what his inputs had to be politically at the beginning to give Senator so-and-so the answer that he was demanding at the end. Okay? So don't tell me about we have to stick to the formula. The formula is whatever the formula needs to be. Okay? Which is why it's so important for us to take the one opportunity we get every generation that they create one, and to put the right inputs in it, and to make it so that they can use it. What I keep hearing from legislators is, hey Dave, be careful what you wish for. That's your members that'll get burned if we change the formula, because they're the ones that have lost all the enrollment. And that formula is based on student numbers. And we ratchet that formula down and take away Save Harmless and say we're going to run a formula legitimately. It's your people that are going to suffer, right? Your districts. And I say, only if you're stupid enough to keep a generation-old series of criteria for the formula. Only if you keep student enrollment as the main driving force of the formula, and not what those students need, right? If you're smart enough to figure out what those students need and put that in the formula, nobody loses, right? So anyway, that's kind of where we are. But I didn't want anybody going home suffering from the delusion that we actually pay attention to this thing and do it the way it's supposed to be done. Yeah. Right?
Hi, how are you?
Good.
I would like to just ask what the level of advocacy is from the Rural Schools Association on the basis of connectivity and broadband access. Because at the end of the day, as you mentioned about how can we give kids better, richer experiences, well, we can do that through distance learning and all kinds of really great things that we learned through the pandemic. But what we also learned from the pandemic, well, it's not an equal playing field, especially for our kids in rural districts. 98% connectivity for New York State is not good enough, because there's 2% of our kids that aren't able to play on a level playing field. And I know there's a lot of work being done with other municipalities and other advocacy groups talking about making sure that there is equal access to connectivity and expanding broadband. But I think that is a basic need that our rural students have the right to have in order to access a full and rich education.
You guys made it the fourth highest thing on the list last time we did this. Money was number one, okay, the finances were number one. Lack of access to mental health services was 2, inability to attract and retain school staff was 3, and connectivity, broadband access was number 4. We don't have enough time to talk about, because that's been my personal mission. That's why you see T-Mobile so high profile at our summer conference, because T-Mobile's still trying to pay me back for what rural schools did during their FCC negotiations when they were trying to merge with Sprint. And then when they got done with that, they tried to come into New York State, and Letitia James sued them on the bizarre premise that they were somehow going to dampen competition by doing this, okay? And I sat through 8 hours of the Joint Legislative Commission on Rural Broadband, and I heard lie after lie from the current providers, who would say that the whole, Governor Cuomo used to say it all the time, 98% of New York's covered. Nope. There are coverage zones. And the providers would claim that if anybody in that coverage zone was covered, that coverage zone was covered. And that's how they came up with 98%, when in fact it probably was 2%, right? Like with a 98% need. And I sat there for all of that time and finally testified at the very end, because I they after about 6 hours they got to me and I said, can I wait till the end? And they're like, yeah, we don't care when, you know. So I went at the end and I said, I've heard everything that everybody's had to say. I've heard you castigate the providers. I've heard you be highly critical even of your own state agencies that haven't ridden herd over these guys, that have allowed them to not meet deadlines, that have allowed them to put in misinformation about the way that they're reporting on what's being done. They are years behind what's being done. I said, the only thing that you haven't talked about is the T-Mobile Sprint merger. And the only reason that we were in favor of the T-Mobile Sprint merger was because there were enforceable, identifiable measures in the FCC license that said that they had to spend billions specifically for rural broadband. The only entity that was specifically required to do it. Like, their license ends if they don't meet that deadline, okay? And you haven't heard anything about Sprint in a long time, but you've heard a lot about T-Mobile, and so they don't want to go backwards on that deal. And they have, in fact, they started out, remember that Project 10 Million, and they were giving away hotspots for kids? That was just to meet the initial deadlines. And the most recent thing that they've been involved with is they've got a deadline to create a mass customer service center in Honeoye Falls, okay? And they're behind because they couldn't get anybody to work during the requirement was before the pandemic, and the deadline is after the pandemic, but they haven't been able to get anybody to do that work, right? And so they came to us to say, hey, could you try and get New York's agency to be reasonable about this? Like, they know we couldn't get people to work here. We're trying to get the thing built. And it was a little out of character for us to be able to do it. For us to go to a state agency and say, hey, is it okay with you that these people are late in putting a massive employer in a rural area? Right? Not what I do every day, right? But the fact of the matter is that their long-term plan for New York will, in fact, provide universal broadband access. It's identifiable and verifiable in their license, their ability to operate in any capacity, not just in providing that, but to sell you the phones and the rest of the stuff they make all their fortune off of is all dependent upon that, right? So we've done a boatload of work, you know, to try and make sure that that happens, because the lack of broadband, as you've all identified, is the biggest impediment to providing some measure of equality in education when you've got high sparsity in the area.
Hi, my name's
Hi.
Nikki Buck. I'm here with the United Way, but I'm kind of wearing my parent hat right now. And my biggest concern for the rural schools is childcare before preschool. I don't think we can get the parents to come to this area if we don't have the ability to provide childcare before preschool. I know this is considered a childcare desert, so that's just, I think, something to consider for this area specifically. But I think I've had my child on the Sibley waiting list for over 2 years. So I think that's a really big piece of this. And then my second one for a solution would be a fundraising arm. So kind of following a SUNY system where they have a college foundation, having high schools do similar to what private high schools do, and having that fundraising arm.
You are looking at the former president of the Brittenkill Alumni Foundation, right? We tried. It fizzled, made a big bang. It was good for a couple of years, and then it was really tough to sustain that. It's tough when it's a pool of a very diverse group of people who have very varying degrees of ability to donate, right? The whole premise behind a college foundation is you've got people in fairly high-paying jobs that have some flexibility, and in high school you've got a fair number who are just trying to get by, right? And it makes that tough. The premise, I love the premise. I worked for the premise because it sounded great. And we did some fairly unorthodox things. Some of you may remember the pouring rights contracts with everybody was choosing Coke or Pepsi for a while for their school, you know, in order to try and get that external source of revenue to make up for like the local share of trying to put in AstroTurf or an artificial track, things that the state wouldn't pay for, right? So schools have tried to be creative and kind of push the envelope on what's being done. What you're saying about basically pre-K, you know, what you're suggesting, first of all, in many instances is really important because, let's face it, we've got a lot of households that kids are coming to school with language deficits, with a deficit in the interaction that they've been able to have because they haven't had a sufficient interaction in their development in the first couple years of their life. So sometimes the best thing I think you can do is to get a kid into a social environment where that develops early on, right? And what you're listing is there's an economic development component to it. I know because I just found out last week I'm going to be a grandpa. And the first thing my son said, and this is the one who's the managing attorney for Salino Law, right? First thing Patrick said, I love his dog. And so he gave me a onesie that said, you've been promoted from dog grandparent to human grandparent. That's how I found out that I was going to be a grandparent, right? First question he asked me is, those T-ball games are twice a week. Where's your apartment going to be? Right? And the first words out of my wife's mouth, and she meant them, was, and she ran a daycare for 25 years, I don't want him going to daycare. I want to be the daycare. Right? What I said was, if Rory's the dog, I said, if Rory doesn't get along with the baby, I get Rory. Right? But the fact of the matter is, I'll bet you dollars to donuts, because I'm not going to argue over this, that at some point I may be working remotely from around the corner from Patrick so that we can provide childcare, because I know what that costs. And it makes it impossible for a lot of people to work. You know, particularly in a rural area, if you've got to drop off the child, and then you've got to get to work, and then you've got to get back to get the child, and then you've got to get back from work, and it's exhausting. You know, and if you're doing that for a low-paying job that's barely making the payments to pay the child care, for the child care, you know, it's a zero-sum game.
Yeah, absolutely. And Chris had mentioned the Alice families as well, right? So
The what? I'm sorry.
Alice families, so people who are working but are just above that poverty line. I can't imagine that's easy for them. You know, if I'm
Like my younger son.
yeah. Well, you know, if I'm someone with a little bit of means who can't get, you know, their child in daycare for over 2 years, I can't imagine what that looks like for other folks.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's true, because for as long as the state has talked about universal pre-K, it's been focused in urban centers. The focus of the leaders was, how do we take impoverished people in the city and set up something so that they can work? You know, it was years into that game that anybody ever thought about spreading that out to, and quite honestly, this plays politics. Why are we going to worry about spreading that to where the other party's in power? Let them worry about that, because the Republicans were in charge of the Senate, and that was largely in rural areas. So if they want that, let them put their money into the budget for that. We're going to put it into the city, and only they stayed committed to that, right? The Senate majority that I work for had different priorities, right? And so you never saw, until recently, even pre-K flourishing, or, you know, a requirement for universal kindergarten even for years and years. So it's been tough to build that in, and now it's tough to get the qualified people to do the work. You know, so it's always had challenges.
Dave, over here.
Yeah.
Hi, Gary Douglas, I'm president of the North Country Chamber of Commerce.
Hi, Gary.
And I can affirm, as you do, that there is life after political staff work. I ran a congressional operation for 14 years, don't blame me, I just worked there. And I worked in the state senate back in 1972 when we moved into the brand new legislative office building. So that'll age me.
I didn't get there for a decade later, but this is my 40th year, so we'll commiserate afterwards over.
Well, I then came home to take over the Chamber of Commerce 31 years ago, and one of the points I wanted to make goes back to the very beginning, which is the importance of regionalization of everything. And BOCES is probably the longest standing model of that in areas like ours, but there are so many more, including our chamber, which regionalized the business community over the last 30 years to create a 5-county regional chamber of commerce with 4,000 members. United Way has done this, Red Cross, other organizations. We need to regionalize, folks. If it's Malone or Ticonderoga or Beekman County against the world, guess who's going to win every single time? So parochialism has diminished, but it needs to finish diminishing. It needs to go away, and we need to regionalize. And there's no area that's more important than training, workforce training, education, schools, CV Tech, organizations like that. And it's happening here. But more needs to happen, and we need to be supportive of that. I also wanted to quickly disagree with something you just said. I thought the suggestion of more creative ways to fundraise through schools is a good one. Not all schools do a good job of that. My school district where my daughter went to high school, she played violin, she was in the music program. Their idea of fundraising was to sell candles. And then maybe $1 out of the candle that you didn't want, that you bought, maybe you went to the program. They never, in spite of repeated suggestions on my part, would put out a list at the beginning of the year for parents to consider. We'd like to buy a new tuba. Here's the amount of money it would cost. We would like to send our teacher, our music teacher, to this program. Here's the amount of money it would cost. I know there are parents that would step up every year and contribute towards something if they knew what it was they were contributing towards. So I think that's a point to be made, that there is a lot more that can be done in schools, and there are parents that would contribute if the ask is made, and the ask is made in the right way that they can respond to, and not just sell them a candle. The third point on broadband is we don't have Sprint and T-Mobile up here, irrelevant to us. Our challenge up here remains the last mile physical dissemination of broadband, and it's far less than 98%, particularly in areas of the Adirondacks. We are left after a tremendous effort by Governor Cuomo to invest tremendously in furthering broadband, no question about that. Large areas here in Clinton County and of the Adirondacks are served now that weren't served before that effort. That effort didn't finish the job. We have the possibility now with the federal funds that are being provided to the state, but we need to make sure the state invests those in the right way. And I'm not sure that's going to happen. They need to acknowledge the areas that are left are by their nature the toughest areas to do. That's why they're left. And they're going to need very creative and very high levels of public investment versus the private dollars to get those last miles done. Up here, the main builders of broadband are small regional telecom companies. They're not the big players. And they need to be worked with differently. So I give that back to you in terms of a next iteration of thought about from where we are now to how we finish the job. The dollars are coming, but we need to make sure the state spends them the right way. And the final thing, which is just a notation, I don't know where you go with it, but I just feel it needs to be said. I think as we educate and work with the downstate legislators who dominate the state legislature, rural means farms and cows to them. Rural isn't farms and cows. Farms and cows are a dimension of rural. We have agriculture around here, and it's important. We also happen here in Plattsburgh to have one of the most vibrant and diverse manufacturing communities in upstate New York. So
I couldn't even find my way through it. You've got so much of it over here.
Rural includes manufacturing centers and includes all sorts of things. And so we need to be careful about the term rural and what it means when we're talking to legislators who just think rural means farms, it means Amish and buggies.
Let me give you some good news and agree with you, which is odd for me. I was once introduced down on Long Island to the Nassau-Suffolk School Boards Association's annual meeting, 400 people, and the guy got up and said, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, the Prince of Freaking Darkness, Dave Little." Right? Because
that's what they call me around here.
yeah. Well, it's because my philosophy was always, I'm not here to tell you what you want to hear, I'm here to tell you what you need to know, right? And that often was challenging, right? So I'm doing my thing at the National Rural Education Association National Conference, and there's a guy up there with me named Dr. Ben Winchester out of the University of Minnesota. And I got done talking, and he said, "Why would anybody move to a rural area listening to the way you talk about it?" He said, "All you talk about are the problems. Why aren't you talking about all the reasons to be there, right? Why people would want to be there?" He said, especially in New York. He said, other places in the country, Their rural areas are just rural areas. He said, your rural areas have names, internationally known names. You know, the Catskills, the Adirondacks, the Finger Lakes, the Thousand Islands. I mean, people have reasons to go there and be there. They're so gorgeous, you know. And he said, make sure that you know what you're talking about. Because I was saying things like, rural schools have a tough time competing economically for new teachers, which is true. You know, I wasn't lying, it's true. And I would follow it up by saying, plus you've got a social element, because if I'm 25 years old, why would I willingly move to a place that's got 6 people my age? Right? So it's tough to get them out. Other states have done some pretty creative things. The 4-day school week, because people may be willing to commute 4 days as opposed to 5, live in a suburban area but be willing to commute out in that area. There are the equivalent of BOCES out west that build housing for their teachers, right? Because think about this, and this was that was Winchester's answer in full to me, was those aren't the reasons you don't have teachers coming to your area. He said you have no place for them to live, and you think town by town, school district by school district. You don't think by region, because your region probably has everything that they want, and everything is accessible within a reasonable amount of time to them within that region. But you don't advertise it that way because you're competing with your next door neighbor for the same person, right? And so you're talking about what you have versus what they have, not what the region has, okay? He said the main reason you can't get people is housing. He said people live in their houses 20 years longer than they used to. You might have seen there's an old Jerry Seinfeld stand-up routine where he talks about the Gulf police from Florida coming to get his parents. Like, get your clubs, Dad, it's time to go, you're 65, it's time to go to Florida, right? He said people don't do that anymore. People stay until their mid-80s. They get taken from their homes now. Okay, so there's not a housing stock turnover. And I don't know whether you have it in this area, but there are many rural areas. They don't want lower income modular housing. They don't want multi-dwelling units put up. It's not in character with their area. Well, that's what somebody coming out of college and working in a rural school can afford to live in, right? They certainly aren't going to build their own, right? And so if you don't have a place to put them where they can live, they're not coming, right? They're not coming.
Yeah, no, Ken, that's a very real challenge, particularly in the Adirondacks, where pre-pandemic was already a crisis. Post-pandemic, the pandemic sent everybody with money from New York up to buy homes, to make them second homes and get out of the cities. Has driven up the property values for most of the Adirondack Park to a point where the communities aren't sustainable. When the older people that still own the home die, finally retire to Florida, move off, the home gets sold into the second home market or the Airbnb market, and the housing is just gone for working class people, the teachers, the mechanics, the nurses, even the doctors.
Well, even the people that grew up there can't afford to. My parents sold their house and I couldn't afford, my dad would have done everything but give it to me. And I couldn't pay the taxes on it at the time, right? I mean, I might have been able to afford the house. I couldn't afford to keep it up, right, and pay for it. So, and you've got a whole generation that's facing that, because many of our communities, they've got lakefront property or they've got resort property, and people coming in that have driven it up beyond the ability of locals to purchase the property themselves. That one's a tough answer, you know. Yeah.
My name's Chris Mazzella. I'm with United Way today, but I also I'm a retired high school principal. I work with an educational nonprofit and work within a grant that is a rural schools, federal government funded grant that triangulates local colleges and business. But it came from the federal government. I guess my question is, if you're looking for things to take back, that we've tried early college high school programs, I think, both within Franklin, St. Lawrence, and Clinton County, none of those sustained. But they have sustained in more suburban urban areas. game management. We have an amazing BOCES that is carrying the ball. But there are so many rural students that don't know what they don't know, like you said earlier. What you have here, that you can get educated, you can stay right in this region, and you can get very good high-paying jobs that can sustain. So I guess what I'm saying is, I'm working within this, a nonprofit at the federal level, but what can the state, how can you go back to the state and say, this is some of the programming that rural schools need? That these students need to know they can go to really good paying jobs through their local community college or through Plattsburgh State or Potsdam State. I mean, it's all 10 regional state colleges and private colleges across the North Country that is part of this. So I don't have an answer, but I think that might be something you can take back and say, we don't want the drain.
Yeah.
What can the New York State Business Council do to continue to
Step one's
support
got to be
most
keeping
rural
what you
schools?
have, the people that you have.
Pardon me?
Step one always has to be keeping the people that are already
Right.
here, you know? There's a great program that runs through Herkimer Community College that uses 3D headsets, right? They've gone out and done 3D imaging of all kinds of manufacturing firms. They work with the manufacturers in their area, production. You know, manufacturing isn't Henry Ford's manufacturing anymore, you know? And you put on this virtual reality headset and a student can see in 15 minutes what it would be like to work in this manufacturing facility, what it would be like to work. They can take a tour, they can talk to people, and it's on theirs. They walk over here with the headset on and they see what's over here, and then they walk over there and they can see what that person's doing, and that type of thing. And, you know, so it really gives the opportunity for a broad variety of experiences to let them know what's available. That's their push, is to let the students in that area know what's available. And I think it's that kind of thing, that something that interests the students so that they don't naturally think, I have to go somewhere to be somebody.
I think post-pandemic, just last week, the gentleman who's the board member at NAC sent their entire 10th grade class to the Development Corporation and then Lake Community College. And the kids got to actually go in the facilities. And they had sessions. And that was a great example of what you're saying. And they got to do it live. I guess the question is, at some point, rural schools don't have the resources. Go back to what Mrs. Berry was saying about busing. They can't just bus kids. I like the virtual thing, but I think kids need to see the retention even before they go to CV Tech. They've got to be able to see it, and I think that is a way to help retention. And, you know, if we're going to advocate to you know, the state, somewhere along the line, rural schools have to get more of job shadowing and job exploration and pathways through their community college. I mean, utilizing regional community colleges up here, I think we have maybe one program. I think that's something that more funding needs to be put in that for students. And I'm sure it's happening in other places in the state, but I think it's much more likely in suburban areas like, you know, Glens Falls and SUNY Adirondack as compared to, you know, Keene and North Country Community College. You know,
Almost 50 years ago, I took the military aptitude battery test. Remember those? I don't even know whether I've said it right after all that time. And I had such a ball taking the test. I came out, they told me I was going to be an electrician. Okay.
told me I was going to be a mechanic.
And
Technician now. No such thing as
Yeah.
mechanics.
Right.
So, first of all, Dave, thanks for being here this evening. I know that,
Yeah, thank you too.
Folks are probably gonna be dreading that I've got the microphone right now, but I appreciate the opportunity to speak. One thing I wanted to just say, my name's Dr. Alex Nady. I'm president of SUNY Plattsburgh. Thank you very much for the introduction. I was a rural student kid. I got on a school bus every day. I in 8th grade I was told I should become an electrician. And I said, wrong, that's my dad. So the point being is that you never know where you're going to land if you're a rural kid. However, what I've heard tonight is that there's a moral imperative in the state of New York to educate every child well, equitably, and certainly in an equal way to provide them an opportunity for their future. And I think that's important. I think what we've also heard is there are some logistical, I'll say, hiccups that are in the road right now in order to do this in a consistent, maybe a connected way. I firmly believe that the role of SUNY Plattsburgh is to elevate the economic prosperity of the North Country. And I will say that every time I go to a meeting. I work very closely with Gary, and I'm going to snuggle over here with Gary. What we do feeds into what Gary's vision is for the North Country as well. The talent you need to support the North Country is in our schools. It's in the pre-K, it's in K-12, it's also in the community college, it's also at SUNY Plattsburgh. So the talent's here. What we have to do is encourage the local talent to come to the community college and to the university. I wanted to just simply say there is a program in place right now, and it's being helped by Denise Smart and by Andrea Nettie, two people I'm very, very close to as well. It's called our I've Been Admitted to College program. We bring 8th graders. We brought 600 8th graders to the community, from the community to SUNY Plattsburgh. Not to simply say, hey, you should be a college student, but to demystify what a college experience looks like. That there are majors you don't know exist. That there are job opportunities that exist. These students come to us, they're 8th graders, and they're interesting individuals. And I say that with a lot of, I'll say, love and affection. But what these students have in their minds is, first of all, how am I going to pay for this? And we say, the last thing you should worry about is how do you pay for this? That's why we have scholarships. That's why we have very generous benefactors who help lower the cost of tuition. You need to be focused on your education. Dream big and don't close any doors, because anyone who holds a post-high school degree typically can earn up to $1 million a year. And I said it's not about the money. It's about, imagine you and all your friends having an extra $1 million to spend in your community to elevate the prosperity of your family, your local community, and those who come to live in your community. I said that's what it's all about. So we want to be a solid partner. So I'm really interested in this regional idea of BOCES. How can we support the BOCES and maybe some sort of regionalization? But I think that what I would like to do is just have this wraparound approach. We're all in this together. I think that there's an opportunity to elevate what we do with North Country students to stay local, to work local, and to have the most incredible life that they can imagine. Because you're right, this is a beautiful place. You don't have the Adirondacks in every corner of the community or of the world. You don't have the access to where you can go to Lake Placid or across the lake on Champlain. We have a lot going for us, and I think that we just need to work as a group together to leverage the incredible talent that's already here and pass it on generation to generation. So with that, I'm done. Thanks, Dave.
Well said. Anybody else? Well, I'll wrap up with one of my favorite stories. Actually, I'll give you two favorite stories, and I'll try and make them quick. One, I was in Washington, D.C., going to the Capitol, and I took a cab. And I don't know what island he was from, but my cab driver was from an island in the Caribbean. And just in conversation, he said, what are you going to the Capitol for? And I said, to lobby for public education. And he goes, this country. He said, this country allows everybody to go to school. Like that was, we forget, right? He said, everybody here gets to go to school. He goes, you come and pick them up and take them to school. He said, and you feed them when they're there. He said, and if they want to go to college after that, you'll let them go to college, and then they can pay you back when they've got a job that they've had the education that allows them to get a job. He goes, oh, this country, right? I'd never looked at it like that before, right? I live in the world of everything that's wrong that we have to fix, and not the joy of the possibilities of what we could be doing. I told you that story to tell you this one. My buddy Brian Loretti, God rest his soul, he just left us last year. Brian was the New Jersey State discus champion. He went to UConn on a track scholarship, so you can imagine Brian, right? Full beard and massive, okay? His dad was an eye surgeon in New York City, and the only way I can describe their house was the old Beverly Hillbilly show. It had pillars and a driveway like that and a fountain in the middle. It was as New Jersey Italian as you could get, okay? Brian comes home from our first semester at law school, and he comes down to breakfast, and there's a little breakfast nook off of the kitchen. Very traditional. Dad's in his robe and slippers, and he's behind the newspaper, and he never looks up. And Brian's mom comes over, and she hands him breakfast that she had just made, and she doesn't say anything. And Brian's thinking, what the heck's going on? I've been away at school for 3 months. This is a very tight-knit family, right? And nobody has said anything. Finally, his dad, without ever looking from behind the newspaper, said, Brian, do you have a little bit to drink last night? And Brian said, well, yeah, Dad, exams were over. I flew home. The guys picked me up. They wanted to celebrate a little bit before I came home. He said, why do you ask? And his dad said, no reason. It's just been a long time since you crawled into bed between your mother and I. And the reason I told you that story is to get you to think about strange bedfellows. Okay? Because strange bedfellows is how we create our way out of this crisis, about thinking about things differently, different partners, different ways of doing things, and a different approach with our state is what we need to try and get all the things done that we've identified that we need tonight. I can't thank you enough for being here and providing this kind of information. We'll put all this together. We'll create a list of the most urgent things that we need to do, and then we'll start working on them. And don't be surprised if I say, remember me mouthing off at the regional forum, I need you to do such and such as part of that plan to get there, you know, because as I say, I give them theories, you make them care, right? So thanks a lot for being here, folks.